Dr. Doug Lucas here, dual board certified physician in anti-aging and regenerative medicine, as well as orthopedic surgery, and founder of Optimal Bone Health MD. If you have osteoporosis or osteopenia and you have been told to avoid vitamin A or retinol or beta carotene because of the increased risk of hip fracture, you're going to want to listen up, because I have heard this over and over again now on our YouTube comments from our patients and our other clients who are trying to figure out, what is the right diet for me? What should I be avoiding? What supplements should I be taking? Does this thing really increase my risk of fracture? And the answer is there's some evidence to support that. But we really, as usual, have to dig into the evidence to help separate the dogma, the myth, and some of the story that goes along with that to really come up with the conclusion of, should we be consuming vitamin A? Is retinol really dangerous? What, if any, should we be getting through diet? And what about supplementation? So stick around. We're going to get through all of this and we're going to come up with some answers on the other side. Okay, so before we get to what is the best form of vitamin A and how much should I take and where do I get it? I know that's what you want, but we got to lay some groundwork here. So what is vitamin A? First of all, well, vitamin A, like all the other vitamins, are a micronutrient that can come either from supplementation. It can actually come in the form of beta carotene or other carotenoids from plants. And then it also can come in an activated form or the animal form, which is in retinol. And there's some other weird names in there like retinol esters, and there's a whole bunch of awkward terminology here. But basically, we're going to talk about carotenoids, which the most common and famous one is beta carotene, and then retinol is what we'll call the activated form or the animal form. Okay, so there's those two forms, and ultimately you're going to get the plant form from plants and the animal form from animals, but they are going to work differently in the body, and this is a really important point. So when we dig into the evidence that people point to when they are concerned about retinol exposure or consumption, and they're going to make recommendations to say, hey, you shouldn't do this thing, a lot of times they'll point to this 2014 study. So this is a meta-analysis that looks at vitamin A consumption, and it doesn't really separate consumption from supplementation or diet. It's just overall consumption, and it also looks at blood levels of retinol, which is really helpful. And then it looked at an outcome of either fractured, meaning all fractures, or hip fracture. And it tried to separate those two, which was actually really helpful. So you can see that this study was published again in 2014 in the Journal of Bone and Mineral Research. But the authors in the abstract say some very clear things. I'm going to read this so that I'm not misquoting them. And so what they say is that the risk of total fracture does not differ significantly by level of vitamin A, either intake or blood level. I'm going to say that again. The risk of total fracture does not differ but by level of vitamin A intake or by levels in blood. So, okay, case closed. I guess it's not a problem. But wait. Then they go on to say that there is, in the meta-analysis, a dose-response curve that shows a U-shaped relationship. And I'm going to show you what that means in a minute. But basically, I'm going to continue to quote here. It says that blood retinol is a double-edged sword for risk of hip fracture specifically. Now, you know that I'm always trying to avoid hip fracture, so that is a big deal. So this caught my attention. And then they go on to say this: to avoid the risk of hip fracture caused by too low or too high a level of retinol, we suggest that the intake of beta carotene, which should be converted to retinol in blood, may be better than intake of retinol from meat, which is directly absorbed into blood after intake. Now, when I read this, my little bias flag started waving because first of all, there's no retinol in meat, or extremely very low levels of retinol in meat. So this tells me that there may be some bias here. And secondly, when they say that beta carotene should be converted into retinol in blood, that's a big should, and we'll talk about why. But before we get there, let's talk about this dose relationship response. So if you look at this chart here, so this is from the study, and what this shows is that the relative risk of fracture, so this is the vertical limb here, the relative risk of fracture goes up or down, and then it goes up and down based off of the blood retinol level. So that's on the bottom part here. So blood retinol levels. So the higher your blood retinol levels, the relative risk, meaning the risk of hip fracture, starts to go down, meaning that the risk is getting better, but then it starts to go up. It gets worse, right? And then you kind of see it plateaus there at the end. And so this is called a U-shaped response curve, meaning that the less you have, the better, and the more you have, the better. Okay, so that seems relatively convincing. So despite my bias flag being waved, I moved on. So they go on to say this further in the study, and I believe this is in the conclusion. And it says, to avoid the risk of hip fracture caused by too low or too high a level of retinol concentration, we suggest that the intake of beta-carotene, a provitamin A, which is mainly from plant-based foods and should be converted through a process adjusted by a feedback mechanism to retinol in the blood, may be better than retinol from meat. And by meat now they mean fish, liver, poultry, or dairy foods, which will be directly absorbed into the blood after intake. Okay, so they put out there plant-based foods, and so they're basically saying consume beta-carotene. All right, so I'll take this for what it is. It's a meta-analysis. It's a reasonably well-done study, even if they had bias. The statistics show what they show. So then the question is there any mechanism that supports this, or should we be looking for some kind of confounding variable here? And the answer is maybe both. So we go on to look at the evidence. So this evidence would show that there is this second study that I have here, and this is a basic science study that looks at essentially mouse femurs, and it looks at them very early on in life. And you can see this study here. This study is, it's called retinoic acid, which is vitamin A, and 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D3, which is obviously D3. It says in the title that they stimulate osteoclast formation by different mechanisms. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, basically what these guys did is they took very young mice and they looked at what happened in their bones when you expose them to both vitamin D and to vitamin A. And what it shows is that osteoclasts, so those are the cells that break down bone, osteoclast function increases, although it does so, as it says in the title, by different mechanisms. Okay, so then retinol exposure or vitamin A exposure will cause osteoclasts to increase function in very young mouse femurs. Okay, they go on to say in that study that that isn't true later on in the maturity of mice, but we'll take that again for what it is. Let's start there. And then I got another study here. This is an older 1991 study, and this is looking at vitamin A on bone formation, again, in mice. And what they showed here was that in mice, vitamin A will actually decrease osteoblast formation. So again, it just kind of says, yeah, there is a mechanism here where vitamin A could reduce bone formation, and it could potentially cause bone loss, and that could actually lead to hip fracture. We got to remember, though, that that's a big leap from a baby mouse to an adult human of advanced age, especially. So then if you were to just start with those pieces of evidence, what would your conclusion be? Well, I think the conclusion really is that, man, maybe vitamin A, especially in the form of retinol, is scary, and maybe it's going to increase my risk of fracture. And it's directly absorbed into the blood, and it'll give us too much vitamin A, and therefore we should get our vitamin A from plants, specifically from beta-carotene, because it should get absorbed and it should get converted, and that seems to be the safe thing to do. So I'm going to do that. So one of the seeds that I'm just going to plant here would be to say, well, if that's the case, then where would you be getting your vitamin A? And a list of vitamin A foods would include, of plant foods, would include sweet potatoes, carrots, dark green leafy veggies, squash, cantaloupe. And those are all fine if you tolerate those foods. So I'm not saying don't eat those foods, but those are all of the plants that have a large amount of beta-carotene or other carotenoids in them for absorption. So that's what you would have to be eating. And then you would have to be avoiding what they just said: fish, poultry, potentially liver, eggs, milk, butter, cheese, all those things, because those things are dangerous. Please put them away. And you can clearly see how, if someone had a bias against animal products, that this could easily be leveraged and potentially taken out of context. All right, so what should we be doing with vitamin A? We'll stick around. Hey, sorry to interrupt this conversation on vitamin A, but if you are enjoying this content, please click the subscribe button for me. The more people that subscribe, the more likely this is to be recommended to people that are looking for answers to their own bone health journey. The more people that subscribe, the more the algorithm is going to drive this forward. So please, if you're not subscribed, please subscribe. Secondly, if you like it, click like. If you want to sign up for notifications, we'll send you a notification when new content is delivered. And if you know anybody that would benefit from this, please share this with them. If you're interested in learning more about how you can manage osteoporosis on your own, look for our free masterclass link in the description below. That'll get you registered for that. If you want to talk to one of our team members about how we manage osteoporosis and osteopenia, look for this link up here. You can click on that. That'll take you down a form which will actually get you scheduled with one of our team members. And lastly, we have a new book coming out. At the time of this recording, we're about 4 weeks out from the launch of our book. So if you look in the description, you should see a link that says, click here for our free ebook or something to that effect. And you can actually download my new book for free in the ebook version, or you can click on a link, which will take you to Amazon and purchase the hard copy version. All right, let's keep going. All right, so if vitamin A was on trial here, this would be where the plaintiff's attorney would sit down and the defense would stand up and straighten their suit and get ready to go. And I'm doing this in this style because I want to almost defend vitamin A to some extent, but I also want to help people who are just struggling with the fear of trying to figure out what to eat. It is so challenging and so confusing when you get out there and you start listening to all of the voices and the biases and all of the dogma that comes around with nutrition. So again, I'm just trying to help people to understand that this is something that potentially we don't need to fear. So let's get into that side of this argument. All right, so if we go back to that first study, right, and this is where they said that there was an increased risk of hip fracture, and I mentioned out of the gate, because they talk about it in the abstract, that there was not an increased risk of total fracture. Now, this is always confusing to me, and this is where statistics can be funny. So basically what it says is that all fractures, when you lump them together, there was not an increased risk for, but hip fractures, there are. So that sort of, for me, weakens the argument that says that maybe there is something going on here and that there isn't some other confounding factor, because ultimately, why would hip fractures alone be affected by this and not total fractures? I'm not saying it's not true, but it certainly raises my bias, concern, and radar, and I think that maybe we need to look a little bit further. Secondly, I mentioned in the second study, the mouse study on vitamin A and vitamin D, that even in the title, it says that both of these vitamins will increase osteoclast function in baby mouse femurs. And it's interesting to say that vitamin A will do that, and this is what we're talking about and concerned about, but also, wait, is it vitamin D good for bones? Don't we know pretty clearly that vitamin D, either consumption through diet, exposure from the sun, or supplementation will improve bone quality and quantity? So if vitamin A does the same thing as vitamin D, isn't that a good thing? So again, I question that takeaway from that study. And I think the big thing here is too, that like a mouse femur for the first 2 weeks of life, and then it doesn't do that same thing for the rest of their life, it's hard to extrapolate that to a mature adult human. So I think you're making a really big leap there. And then thirdly, the other study again on baby mice femurs. And so, again, you're making that same extrapolation. So the studies, yes, they do support the idea, but again, I think we need to look a little bit further. Another thing to consider, and this is where, in that study, when they say it should be converted, this is beta carotene, should be converted to retinol. That's a really big should. And if you look into this, the amount of absorption of beta carotenes or other carotenoids is extremely variable, where you might need between 10 to 12, up to like 30 times the same amount of beta carotene to get the same amount of equivalent of retinol as retinol. And so when you start talking about how much people need, this is a really big factor. In addition to that, there's also genetic differences in how you convert vitamin A. This is one of the things that we test in our practice. And if you are a poor converter of vitamin A, you can take that up to 30 times difference in absorption and then add another multiple to it. And we don't even know what that multiple is. It could be 1, 2, it could be 10, who knows? But we know that not only are you not going to absorb it well, you're not going to potentially convert it well, depending on your genetics. So when we start talking about how much should you get, it makes it really hard to know, right? And so then we'll talk about testing in a minute. But before we do that, let's talk about the recommended daily allowance. So the RDA or RDI is another way to look at it. The RDI and RDA of vitamin A are actually the same, and it's about 700 micrograms for women and about 900 micrograms for men. For my international audience, this is all US based, and I did not actually look this up in other countries, so I apologize. US is generally similar to other countries, with the exception of calcium. What's interesting about vitamin A here is that they talk about 700 or 900 micrograms, and then they put beside it RAE as an acronym, as if everybody knows what that means. RAE stands for retinol activity equivalence, meaning that if it's coming from something other than retinol, you have to understand how many retinol equivalents that beta carotene or whatever carotenoid it is will actually end up being in the blood. How do you do that? It's impossible. So really hard to know. So when we start talking about some different amounts of beta carotene or retinol in foods, then we start to get a sense of, how easy is it to get too much vitamin A in our diet? Let's talk about animal stuff first. So an egg has about 50 to 75 micrograms per egg, and this is mostly in the egg yolk. If you, like me, I eat about 4 eggs a day. So I'm getting, around maybe 250 to 300 micrograms of vitamin A in mostly the retinol form, or probably all the retinol form, in one sitting. That's a lot of vitamin A. Cool. Steak, as I mentioned earlier, has almost no vitamin A in it. It has about 5 micrograms per 4 ounces. Other meats, it's variable. But they're mostly actually pretty low unless you are eating organ meat. And liver, for example, has 4,000 to 5,000 micrograms of vitamin A per ounce. So that's a lot of vitamin A. We'll come back to that. All right, so let's talk about beta carotene. So the two most common forms when you think vitamin A, most people think sweet potato and carrots. Okay, so sweet potato has between 1,000 and 1,500 micrograms per medium sweet potato. That is actually, seems like a lot, right? But let's go back to the math. So we don't know how well you're going to absorb it. So is it, do you have to multiply, or rather divide in this case, that number by 10, by 20, by 30? And then do you have to then divide it again if you're not a good converter in the body of vitamin A? So we don't really know, right? So that 1,500 micrograms really could be like 20 or 30 RAE, retinol activity equivalents. We really just don't know. Same thing with a carrot, 500 micrograms. Sounds like a lot. You start doing the math and you're like, well, it's maybe 10 or 20. I don't really know, but it's certainly not 500 and it's not 1,000. So then if we look at this dose relationship response again, and we say, okay, well, we know that we had this curve. Are we more likely to be on the low end or the high end? I think unless you're eating a whole bunch of eggs or liver, you're likely to be on the low end, and we probably shouldn't be worried about getting too much vitamin A, again, unless you're eating a lot of liver. So some people might be asking, and a lot of people that follow me on this channel know that I'm a big advocate for testing. So can this be tested? Yes, it can. We have not historically done this, although after doing the research for this video, we're going to start doing this. Blood retinol testing is a thing. You can do it. The question is how much does it actually help you? Because it's not a good test for the blood stores. It doesn't really tell you if you're deficient over the long term. It just tells you what's been happening in the short term. But I still think it's reasonable to do, and we're going to start playing with it. So look for an update, maybe like a year from now, and you'll see an update about how this has been working in the optimal bone health patients. Because I think it'll be helpful to see, and maybe as a starting point of recommendations. Also, functional tests like the nutrient.Watch, metabolomics, SpectraCell, some of these other functional tests can also give you a sense of vitamin A function and body stores, but these aren't readily available to most people. So yes, it can be tested. But here's another really important point. So there are other reasons why vitamin A levels in blood can go up or down. And this is why testing is good, but testing doesn't necessarily answer the entire question, because there is a list of other things that can cause retinol to be elevated in blood. So let's go through that list. Number 1, alcohol consumption. Uh-oh. How many people in the US drink alcohol? Boy, a lot. So could it be that people that consume alcohol have a higher risk of hip fracture? Oh, they do, actually. So alcohol is a risk factor for hip fracture. So, okay. What about protein deficiency? Do we know that sarcopenic people that follow a vegan diet for a long enough period of time, do they have a higher risk of hip fracture? They do, by 2 to 3 times. So could that be a reason why high levels of blood retinol are associated with hip fracture? Absolutely. What about zinc deficiency? Well, there's not a direct correlation there, but yes, inflammation, direct correlation. Infections, maybe. Depends on the infection. Liver disease, increased age, well, that's certainly associated with hip fracture, right? And so I think when you look at that list, you could say, gosh, maybe retinol is not actually dangerous. And I can't think of anybody that is eating liver on a regular basis that I feel is probably at higher risk of hip fracture. So what do we do with this? So in conclusion, I really feel like this concern about retinol and vitamin A is probably taken out of context, and some people have been pushing this as part of a plant-based agenda. It's really the attempt to take anything that they can out of context and then use it to help push their agenda. So I would not be worried about retinol. I think that there is a healthy user bias here. I think that people that have other healthy lifestyle choices are likely to have less risk of hip fracture and are likely to have more normalized retinol levels. So I think that's what we're seeing here, because unhealthy behaviors like either poor nutrition and protein deficiency or increased alcohol use are likely going to push people out on that U curve that we showed earlier. So then what do we do? Well, I'm not saying that you shouldn't eat plants. I'm not saying don't eat sweet potatoes. If you can tolerate the carbohydrates in carrots and sweet potatoes and they work well for you, then great, do it. Just don't think that 1,000 micrograms of vitamin A that you're getting in a sweet potato is all you need, because it's probably not. In my opinion, I think that we should get an adequate form of retinol. This can either come through food or it even can come through supplementation. Some of the supplements that we use have a good amount of retinol in them. That's why we use them, but you'll find that most supplementation does not. If you are concerned about this and you think that you maybe are getting too much retinol or maybe you don't have enough, get tested. This is something, again, you can test it in blood, and you can potentially do the functional testing to see functionally what things look like for you. And then lastly, remember where you can get these things. So beef liver from animals, beef liver, cod liver oil, butter, milk, cheese, egg yolks, not the whites, the yolks. And then from a plant perspective, sweet potatoes, carrots, dark green leafy veggies, squash, and a cantaloupe, if you're into cantaloupes. But remember that you have to do some kind of an unknown math equation there, and it's divided by 10, 20, 30, or who knows what. And that can be a challenge. So again, I think that we are probably reading too much into this literature. It's likely being taken out of context, and this is something that you should not lose sleep over. All right, so that's it. You made it to the end of the talk on vitamin A. Again, remember, if you like this content, please subscribe and help other people to get exposed to this channel. If you like it, like it. If you want notifications, you can sign up for those too. Please share this with anybody that you think would benefit. That's easy enough to do with the little arrow tag. If you want to get our free ebook, look for that link in the description below. It's called The Osteoporosis Breakthrough, the Natural Way to Reverse Causes of Bone Loss and Build Stronger Bone. If you want to sign up for our free masterclass to learn of other things you can do on your own to help you on your bone health journey, that link is in the description as well. If you want to talk to one of our team members, look for the link up here. Finally, we want to hear from you. Please leave comments, questions, ideas for other topics. I love this YouTube community that we are creating and fostering. It is amazing. So thank you so much. I'm glad you made it to the end of this video. We'll see you on the next one.